Hey everyone, welcome to the Being Patient podcast. I'm Deborah Kahn, founder of Being Patient. When my mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, I decided to use my skills as a journalist in a different way. Frustrated by the lack of information on science and the inability to get different expert opinions, I decided to quit my job at the Wall Street Journal to create a better platform for people impacted by dementia. We are a community where news and information is created by our team of journalists. We ask tough questions and we simplify the science so that anyone can understand. We don't only cover disease, but delve into the latest research on what it takes to keep our brains healthy. We invite the experts and ask your questions. Here's today's podcast. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Being Patient Brain Talks. I'm Deborah Kahn, founder of Being Patient. A lot of you have told us how hard it is to get an Alzheimer's diagnosis or a dementia diagnosis for that matter. A lot of misdiagnosis out there. So we thought we would bring to you one of the best in the industry, Dr. Marwan Sabbagh, who is at Barrow Neurological Institute and joins us now. Welcome, Marwan. Always really good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you.
Okay, so let's just start with, we hear this all the time from members of our community that they can't get an accurate diagnosis, or it took years, or they're still not sure. Why is this so hard to diagnose people with Alzheimer's disease?
So this has been the kind of the bane of a lot of industry's existence, is that they're afraid that, there are all these new drugs, exciting developments, and nobody can diagnose it. Fundamentally, it boils down to the fact that primary care physicians don't feel comfortable making a diagnosis. They get 36 months of training, 1 month of neurology. If they're lucky, they get 1 day in the cognitive clinic. And yet we lay everything on the back of a primary care physician who does not feel comfortable making these diagnoses. And the consequence is that they delay a diagnosis, they delay referring. They don't feel like it's necessary to screen patients. They dismiss symptoms. Oh, you're depressed, you're tired, you're sad, you're this, you're that. But they don't take it on head on. And that's been a problem.
Do you think it's because, the first line of, the healthcare system, people tend to go to their GPs before they're going to make an appointment with a neurologist?
Yes.
That discomfort, usually most people I've spoken to who I know have gotten a diagnosis, it always starts with MCI. It's never like you have full-blown Alzheimer's. It's like, oh, it's MCI. Right. So tell us a little bit about that, like diagnosing MCI first. I would venture to say in 90% of cases, it's MCI first.
I think that, so MCI, of course, as you know, both MCI and dementia are categorical definitions, Deborah. So that means that MCI is cognitive impairment without functional impairment, still independent, but still having some cognitive issues. Dementia is a categorical definition of cognitive impairment with functional impairment. We want to capture people in the MCI phase. I think doctors don't know when the person goes from MCI to dementia. They don't, even in the lay audience, doesn't understand that Alzheimer's is a type of dementia. So category type Alzheimer, dementia, Alzheimer type. And so physicians themselves mix these terms up. But, I think that they use the term mild cognitive impairment because they know there's something wrong and they don't want to use the boogeyman word of dementia. So they say it's mild cognitive impairment. And I have to tell you, though, that what physicians have learned, and this is the other problem we face, Deborah, is that we learned in medical school that you can only diagnose Alzheimer's with an autopsy. That is still taught to this day in medical school curriculum. Even though you and I spend our day job seeing the newest biomarkers, the newest breakthroughs, the newest this and the newest that, doctors think you can only diagnose Alzheimer's with an autopsy, that you can, you just check a B12, a TSH, and an MRI, and by exclusion, by default, you have a dementia diagnosis. And and I know that's just not accurate.
Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit, because We know that scans are one way. I mean, the first thing a patient is given is a cognitive assessment, right?
Correct.
And I believe, and I'm not the doctor, and you may agree or disagree with me, but I agree. I think at that early stage, it's hard to give someone a cognitive assessment unless you know what their baseline was, right? Before they were experiencing memory loss. I mean, I even tried this on my own mom when she was first diagnosed. I think I gave her a MoCA test every day for 3 weeks. And it was vastly different according to what her mood and her state was that day. So, and I know that cognitive assessments usually aren't just those MoCA tests. That's just the first test, like you go much deeper. But the variance of her scores in just that few week period was vast. I mean, some days she would nail it, other days she would do terribly. So in my opinion, I'm thinking, do those cognitive assessments actually give us a accurate assessment, or at least the direction of where to go, what to ask next?
So I actually feel like that's one of the problems and challenges we face as practitioners. And we kind of bank heavily on what the cognitive test is. I have proposed and published on the idea that we should first do informative-based questionnaires, and there are many of them now. That's to say, if physicians asking an informant information about the cognitive issues. There's the AQ, Alzheimer questionnaire, the 88, the IQ code, and now called the EQRS or something. But these are ways for the physician to capture if there's incident cognitive decline. As an added value, I do that before the cognitive assessment. So,
what types of questions are being asked on those?
So, Alzheimer questionnaire is not to the patient, but to the informant. Is there memory issues? How long has it been going on? Do they forget appointments? Do they misplace objects? Do they get lost? Do they become disoriented? Do they have problems handling money? I mean, I actually have published a lot on the Alzheimer questionnaire, and we use it in our practice. I've been using it for years on hundreds of patients. Correlates very, very well with progression, correlates very well with a lot of other instruments as well. So that's the instrument we use in Arizona, but there are a lot of other instruments. AD8 is the most common, Alzheimer's disease 8. That's Jim Galvin's IQ code, and then a new one called the EQRS.
Okay, so those will serve as a guide as to what questions you should be asking in order to determine if there is a problem. And those are directed at the practitioner. So
to the informant, not to the patient.
So the spouse or whoever's living with the patient. So when you have that first line of questioning, and then where would you go? To cognitive assessment? Like what's next in a diagnosis?
So I would do cognitive assessment. The most common, of course, is the MoCA, but the mini mental, the slums, the mini cog, whatever you're comfortable with. I actually love, you're in our business for a long time now. I love Mia Kiva-Pelto's, not everybody knows her for the finger study, but well before she ever did a finger study, she did something called the CAIDE score, CAIDE, and it's basically a risk score of Alzheimer's. And so I actually embed that in my practice. So if their CAIDE score is high and their AQ is high and their functional assessment staging scale is high, I know I'm dealing with something in the mild cognitive impairment or dementia, degenerative in nature. I also do a Lewy body screening questionnaire. So what I'm saying is by the time I get to the physical and neurological exam, I can tell if they're normal, mild cognitive impairment, dementia, and I'm just checking the boxes at that point. So use the HPI, very history present illness, and all the questionnaires to drive what I'm doing in my evaluation.
Okay, before we get on to different dementias, I want to talk a little bit about the diagnosis from MCI to Alzheimer's disease. The reaction of the patient and caregiver when they're given an MCI is generally, oh, phew, it's not Alzheimer's, right? It's kind of like, okay, I know I'm experiencing memory problems, but it's not as bad as that Alzheimer's diagnosis, right? But what is it that how do we know when MCI is Alzheimer's disease? And especially as a neurologist, How do you diagnose that? I certainly know a lot of GPs are giving MCI diagnosis and not knowing if it's Alzheimer's yet.
And I think these are the terms that people kind of mix and match. The fact is that MCI as a categorical definition means, like I said, cognitive impairment without functional impairment. The term MCI only is a descriptive term, and the charge is to figure out what is the cause of MCI. So I will call people mild cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's disease if I have the CSF or the PET or something else, and then or Lewy body or Parkinson's or frontotemporal dementia. So you always say MCI due to ... or dementia due to ... So I always start with the categorical definition and the etiological definition. And so people will say, oh, Hugh, I don't have Alzheimer's. I'm like, well, you have MCI and you're showing biologically changes that will lead to dementia and Alzheimer dementia in particular. So I spend a lot of time explaining that.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about those changes too, because I'm assuming that, I mean, now we have blood tests to detect beta amyloid plaque. Usually though, but that's really only available to people in trials. It's not usually presented to the patient yet. Could it coming, but not yet, right?
I actually started ordering them last week in the clinic.
Okay, so it's just, I mean, I am assuming right now you're rare. I'm not.
Yeah. I'm very rare.
Yeah, most people
we're on the front end of everything, so we get to do it all before everybody else does. So that's what's cool about my job.
So, okay, blood tests are much better because a blood test is a blood test. It's much more affordable, but most people won't have that option right now. You know, we know that PET scans detect plaque, but those are hugely expensive and haven't been until the new medications been covered by insurance. So most people wouldn't get a PET scan, put it that way.
Correct.
So how do you diagnose? Like, I assume when you're talking about the biological changes, you're talking about plaque in the brain. Is that
correct.
right?
Amyloid and tau. Correct.
Amyloid and tau.
Right.
So without a blood test, we can talk about the blood test in a second, because it is getting really interesting. But assuming most people don't have access to the blood test unless they're in a trial or something like that,
correct,
then how does a doctor determine whether or not there's plaque or tau, other than doing a PET or a spinal tap?
I do the spinal tap, and I recommend it. And PET scans, you're right, are still out of reach for most people. We're ordering about one a month when patients are willing to pay out of pocket. Until there's a rumor in our world, as you know, that Medicare might change their mind in the very near future, although that has not materialized yet. But the bottom line is I tell them to make the determination as to whether this is Alzheimer's or it's going to get worse. We need to do the lumbar puncture or the spinal tap. And they all kind of cringe. But the fact is, it's about how we present it. I will tell you, we do lumbar punctures for meningitis, encephalitis, multiple sclerosis, and 24 other things. And there's no reason to not do them for Alzheimer's. I do them in my office. We do them across the street in the radiology department. It's not a scary thing like it used to be perceived. It's a 5-minute office procedure, and I tell them that. And we're doing them a couple a week in our office, and it's going fine. I do it myself.
I mean, the reaction to that I hear from patients about a lumbar puncture is it hurts, or sometimes it's hard to find. The area is really narrow, so they have to really, So I think that's why it seems scarier than a scan, right?
We haven't done it. Well, I'll tell you, if there's a lot of reasons not to not do it in the office, we'll send it to the radiology where they do it under fluoroscopy. But a lot of times I do it myself if they're, and it's also experience. I mean, there are actual practices that have dedicated practitioners that just spend their time doing spinal taps. So it's not as big a deal as people make it out to be. This is the time that the popular impressions and the science are a little bit incongruous.
Are spinal taps a lot less expensive and are they covered by insurance?
They're covered by insurance. All told, all costs, including the procedure and the analysis, are about 1/4 of what a PET scan costs. And they are covered nowadays. We need to get the authorizations for the analysis, not for the lumbar puncture. And the lumbar puncture is a standard neurological test covered every single day in the clinic. It's the analysis you have to get approved.
Okay. And so, but can you detect both beta amyloid and tau in a spinal tap, or just tau? Both.
Two forms of tau and one beta amyloid. So we actually look at all. Yes.
You look at all of them. Now, tell me, dispel some of these rumors for me. Is there anyone who has plaque? Well, there are people who have plaque in the brain who never get Alzheimer's or symptoms of Alzheimer's. Do you need plaque in order to have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's?
Yes.
So there's correct. No one who hasn't had plaque in their brain who has Alzheimer's.
Correct. You can have another neurodegenerative disease without amyloid or without plaque, but that's not Alzheimer's. It's something else. But in order to have Alzheimer's, you must have amyloid plaques in the brain.
But I think the confusion arises because there are people who have plaque in their brains and never see a symptom of Alzheimer's. So the tipping point hasn't started with them, right? They have the hallmark, but the symptoms of the disease aren't present.
Well, so the reason that we're kind of a lot of people say, well, amyloid is not sufficient. That's partly true. What we know is that there is an inflection point where amyloid starts to cause damage, and that damage is through the tau and tangles and the spread of tau and tangles. So amyloid does not correlate well with clinical symptoms, as you know, but tau and tangles correlate very, very well with clinical symptoms. So it's the spread of tau and tangles that correlates with clinical symptoms. But the event that leads to the creation and formation of tau and tangles is the presence of amyloid.
Okay. So in other words, people can have amyloid in their brain and not see a symptom of the disease, but usually when there's tau present, you're experiencing symptoms.
Correct. And then when they've looked at all those people who had head full of amyloid but never got dementia, turns out it wasn't the typical 42 amino acid. It was the 40. It's what's called the non-senile plaque. In other words, their amyloid's a little different. It's not the stuff that leads to Alzheimer's disease.
It's not the bad amyloid.
Not the bad amyloid.
I'm going to throw a few common scenarios at you that we hear all the time. The one that makes me most angry is a woman in her 50s or early 60s. Okay, this is played over and over again in people who leave comments on our sites, who I've interviewed. They go to their doctor, they're experiencing something is wrong out of character, right? Whether it's no longer performing at work as well or whatever. And I guarantee you 99% of the time, if they're that age, they're told it's menopause. Okay. Yeah. This is such a common thing that happens. I want to scream because, we have people like Michelle Hall in our community who was excuse my French, a kick-ass lawyer, raised 3 kids, and all of a sudden she's losing words and she's staring at words that she can't spell anymore. And doctors tell her it's menopause. I'm like, how is that possible that a totally uber competent woman who raises 3 kids, has a full-blown career, suddenly can't speak and can't recognize words, and she's being told it's menopause? Yeah.
So several things to say there, Deborah. First, I just saw a very important VIP in our a board member of ours actually, and in her early to mid 50s, same complaint. It turned out her pregnenolone was super duper low, and we gave her pregnenolone because we have a comprehensive lab panel that we run on our patients.
And what is pregnenolone? I don't know what that is.
Pregnenolone is a pre-hormone that becomes something that helps the brain work better. And in fact,
can we all take it?
Sure. If you I don't know if you know Robbie Brinton in the University of Arizona too. She's actually doing a clinical trial of allopregnenolone to treat Alzheimer's. So the reason I'm saying is that we repleted her pregnenolone and her memory fog got much better. So menopause,
so is this a supplement? What is it?
That's a supplement, but it's a pre-hormone.
It's a
pre-hormone.
The
reason I say this to you is that pregnenolone, actually, that's a tangent. My point is that menopause can cause brain fog. I'm not going to deny that, but that's not always the only issue. Okay, I think that these are the time. Ironically, that's the time I have started ordering the blood tests, because at least then I can say, well, it's not Alzheimer's, right? Your plasma tau is normal, your neurofilament light is normal, therefore it's not Alzheimer's. Let's keep looking. And then we do the neuropsych testing, we check their sleep, we check their meds, we check their meds, we check their meds. If you know what I'm saying, people are also self-medicating with stuff that makes their memory worse. Mm-hmm. And then we check for COVID and we check for other things. So I don't automatically go to menopause, but a lot of people do.
Okay, but to the doctors who don't have the resources that you have, right, with the blood tests, et cetera. So
refer to me.
So, well, Marwan, you're going to take on a lot of patients. Everyone hears you say that. I'm not sure you have the time in enough time in the day. But should doctors be giving women a hormone test? And is there a certain level of maybe the drop in estrogen that would indicate that perhaps you have more brain fog?
Yeah, so I know you have experts that can probably comment on that better than I do. But I will tell you, like I said, I have this comprehensive lab panel that draws a lot of things: homocysteine, thyroid, pregnenolone, a lot of other things. And so what I'm saying is that I use that as kind of a guidebook to start to target things to optimize their health. Because everybody who has a memory issue is not always Alzheimer's, right? You know, and I know you can have a memory issue that has nothing to do with Alzheimer's. I see still to this day patients taking medicines that make their memory worse. I see patients with severe problems with their sleep. I see patients with mood issues. So what I'm saying is that there are a lot of things you got to look at in a perimenopausal woman that is, and yes, on it is the change, the delta in their estrogen that may have adverse effects on their cognition, but it's not just that. And I would look at a lot of other things.
Okay, so what are some of the medications that you are aware of that impact memory? I think that would be helpful.
Yes, so all tricyclic antidepressants, amitriptyline, nortriptyline, imipramine. That's number one. Number two is a lot of bladder medicines. Ditropan, oxybutynin also causes a lot of meds. A lot of over-the-counter sleep aids, the Benadryls, the Tylenol PMs, anything that is an anticholinergic, anything that blocks cholinergic activity. So the brain chemical response for memory is acetylcholine. There are a lot of drugs that actually reduce acetylcholine, and a lot of the antihistamines, anti-allergy meds that are the PMs of the world, Tylenol PM, not the Tylenol, but the PM, that's the stuff that actually makes your memory worse.
Interesting. Interesting, because I bet there's tons of people on those meds, right?
Tons. In fact, before I ever see a patient, before I walk in the door to see a patient, the first thing I look at is their medication list. And I am stunned to this day how often people are on meds that make their memory worse. You know, muscle relaxants, narcotics, benzodiazepines, sleep aids. It just takes your breath away. I see a lot of patients who, if I just took away 3/4 of their meds, their cognition would clear up. If I fixed their sleep, their cognition would clear up. So there are a lot of reasons to have memory issues that are not Alzheimer's.
It's super interesting. I'm so glad you us this. I had no idea that so many of those medications interfere. Okay, I want to turn to different dementias because we have so many people. I believe, again, not a scientist, from my very unscientific poll of talking to hundreds of people who have been impacted by dementia, I believe that Lewy body dementia is the most misdiagnosed dementia out there. And I think there's actually more people out there with Lewy body who don't know it than there are other dementias. Do you agree with me or not?
100% agree with you. It is the second most common type of dementia, and nobody's ever heard of it. And until Robin Williams had it, and then the list goes on. Casey Kasem, remember Casey Kasem?
Yeah.
He died of Lewy body dementia.
Oh, I didn't know
Ted
that.
Turner has Lewy body dementia. It's a very common condition that nobody's ever heard of. And so they look at me like, what's that? But I completely agree with you that it's underdiagnosed, misdiagnosed, and often missed.
I want to tell you about, and I bring him up a lot, Don Kent, who a member of our community, I interviewed him. He went to 7 neurologists before he got a diagnosis of Lewy body. Mayo finally diagnosed him because when he was eating what was sweet tasted salty and salty tasted sweet. They were like, that's a hallucination. You have Lewy body dementia, you know? I mean, it wasn't that simple, but obviously he was being, because Lewy body is typically classified first with hallucination. So tell me a little bit, or at least that's what we hear. You tell me, how do you diagnose someone with Lewy body dementia? And what questions should people be asking their doctor to get a better diagnosis?
So the core criteria are Parkinson motor changes, and cognitive coming close together, meaning within a year or two of each other. Hallucinations, where they see things that are not there. Fluctuations, meaning they're better, worse, better, worse, better, worse. And then the last thing is acting out dreams. I have to tell you, I know you know Jim Galvin very well. He's probably been a guest on your program. Jim Galvin is at University of Miami. He created a screening questionnaire called the Lewy Body Clinical Rating Scale. I actually use it in my medical practice every day, every time I see a patient. And it's a great screening tool for Lewy body dementia. And if they score above 6, there's a high probability of Lewy body. And if it's below 3, it's a low probability of Lewy body dementia. And I actually use it so much, I embedded it in my electronic medical record, and I can tell you the score of every single patient I've seen. And if the score is high, already I'm driving down that road. So I'm looking for all those core criteria.
Are there different types of Lewy body, like one that's more closely related to Parkinson's? Isn't there Lewy body Parkinson's versus not, or something?
Yeah, so the UK people, the experts, the real world experts are the people in Newcastle and other places in the UK, Ian McKeith and his colleagues. And the reason I tell you that is they believe there's a psychotic variant and then there's a motor variant, meaning that there's people who have a lot of hallucinations and other people who have mostly motor and Parkinson changes. I'm not sophisticated enough to differentiate. If I call it Lewy body, I'm not going with the subvariants. I'm saying it's Lewy body.
So are you asking, tell us, what are some of the questions on that? Hallucinations obviously is one of them, but what do you ask people to determine? And what would make you think, if someone comes to the doctor, to you and says, my memory is not good, I'm not myself, how do you differentiate at that early stage, Alzheimer's or Lewy body?
Yeah, so I will tell you, a self-report of a memory complaint, I would lean toward Alzheimer's, mainly because people are not self-reporting acting out dreams. They're not self-reporting whether they're hallucinating or not. So I would have to see other complaints from self-report to make that determination. I would also have to look at their clock draw. So, we do the MoCA. You were talking about the MoCA. Yep. I'm sure your mom aced the drawing of the clock.
Actually, the clock was the hardest part. I actually think the clock is the best diagnostic of the MoCA. Because
you know that a lot of people agree with you on that, right? There's a company in Boston called Linus Health. They have done a digital clock draw, and they believe the same thing as you do, that the clock draw is an extraordinarily accurate test. And if they're very mildly affected, but they're having trouble drawing a clock, I start to think about Lewy body, certainly.
But it would be the same for Alzheimer's, wouldn't it? The clock would be difficult.
Not necessarily. You can have not as egregiously impaired.
Okay, it's interesting, because I also think the translation of multiple layers of information with the clock is what makes it difficult, because with Alzheimer's you start to lose your ability to multitask, right?
Yes.
That we have that all the time, and in a way reading a clock is kind of multitasking, because you're thinking the hands aren't literal, 10 to 2 isn't,
yes.
Or 20 to 2, whatever. So and you have so many different layers. So I've always thought that's probably the reason why it's so difficult.
Yes.
Multiple multitasking, right?
It has both organizational and visual spatial as. So yes, the multitasking.
Okay, so what should people be? What's the first thing? Well, what should patients be insisting on if they go to a GP? They're not at a neurologist like yourself, who's very experienced in diagnosing. What are some of the questions they should be asking?
You're talking the physician or the patient?
The patient.
The patient should be asking, about the new blood tests, the new scans, the new technologies. They should not be letting doctors dismiss their complaints. That makes me crazy. I have to tell you, when a doctor says, don't worry about it, you're depressed, you're sad, you're this, you're that. No. If the patient complains about their memory, they should evaluate it or refer on. That's the one thing I would tell you, is tell the patients to keep going and don't let the doctor talk them out of it.
Okay. We got a question a while ago about somebody who had really bad alcoholism and was exhibiting signs of dementia. So this person wants to know, is alcohol dementia a disease, and is it reversible, or does it set you on the track? What's the relationship there with alcohol abuse and dementia?
Absolutely. Alcohol actually causes three kinds of chronic severe alcohol abuse, causes three subtypes of dementia. If you want to get technical, it's the Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, Markia-Favi-Bignami disease, and the alcohol dementia of Maurice-Victor. But the point is that alcohol at high doses can cause severe damage and can cause dementia, usually not progressive. In other words, if they stop drinking, they may not get worse, but not necessarily reversible either.
So you're causing damage, but do people who are suffering, they obviously don't have the hallmarks like plaque and tangles or
That's
things.
correct. They do not.
But the alcohol is causing the damage.
Correct.
Okay, vascular dementia. How do we diagnose vascular dementia?
Yeah. So vascular dementia is really diagnosed through the clinical story of sudden abrupt worsening in cognition that then plateaus and then abruptly gets worse and then plateaus. So what's called a stepwise decline, and MRI changes. A lot of people have a little bit of change on their MRI, and people overcall vascular dementia when it's actually not just age-related findings. But if you have a lot of changes on your MRI, you might think about vascular dementia.
Okay, this is my confusion with my own mom. When she was first experiencing problems, she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, but they found the little like tears on her brain, right? Bleeds on her brain, which is, I guess, it could be normal aging, right?
Yes.
Like people have that with the brain. But what's really puzzled me, and she's now in a later stage, so this doesn't apply, but in the earlier stage, the progression was up and down. Some days I was like, oh, she's doing really well. And other days I'd be like, oh my gosh, she's not doing well at all. Yeah. This happened for a long time. Is that typical of Alzheimer's?
No, that's not typical. That's more typical for vascular or Lewy body.
That's what I thought. So
that's more typical for vascular. Yeah.
So to this day, I have asked, does she actually have vascular dementia? But then do all of these dementias meet when you're in a later stage? So
we know that pure disease is rare. Pure Alzheimer's disease, where you have plaques and tangles and nothing else, is only a third of patients that we call Alzheimer's. The majority of them have other things like vascular, like alpha-synuclein, which is the Lewy body. So in other words, most dementias overlap. Even vascular dementia, 90% of the time have amyloid plaques and tangles in their brain. So a pure vascular dementia where they just have strokes and no plaques and tangles is relatively uncommon. So yes, they do converge.
Is the life is vascular dementia, is it slower, the progression slower than Alzheimer's? Does it just
it's variable. It's variable.
What have you discovered in terms of like the progression of disease? Does it matter? Like what are the variabilities and the factors from like a faster progression versus a slower? Like some people can live for 20 years, right? Or
right.
More.
So I will tell you that having two copies of the APOE4 clearly, once that train has left the station, they're on the express train, and that has been really tough to see. I see a lot of patients declining very quickly if they have two copies of the APOE4. And then Lewy body patients tend to progress more rapidly. So if I had to predict the two groups of people that are likely to progress quickly, it would be Lewy body patients and APOE4 double copy.
Double, not single.
Not single.
Okay, and then Milka is asking a question from our audience. She said, for a patient diagnosed with MCI, how effective are changes in lifestyle, exercise, diet, and delaying Alzheimer's? Good question.
Very well. MCI. Very good. So there's a lot of studies now suggesting that diet, exercise, particularly exercise, does slow the rate of progression, rate of decline. So the lifestyle factors should be implemented as early as possible.
Okay, so you're talking about diet and like the Mediterranean
No,
diet.
So diet is controversial, but clearly we know that cognitive stimulation, blood pressure management, and physical exercise have enough evidence to recommend them. Diet, everybody's on a different opinion on the diet, so there's not enough data to give you enough studies to give official recommendations around diet. But yes, you should be making changes in the mild cognitive impairment that are lifestyle directed.
And then exercise, I assume you're talking about aerobic exercise,
I am
right?
talking about aerobic exercise.
Because we know, what does that do to your hippocampus? What do we know about exercise and the relationship with the brain?
It slows the rate of degeneration of the hippocampus.
It does.
It does.
It's not necessarily making it better, but it's slowing the
Correct.
Okay, got it. Marwan, you're the best.
Thank you,
I'm so
Debbie.
happy that we've had this opportunity to give our audience a chance to hear, because not everyone has access to doctors like yourself. So thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for including me.
It's much appreciated. So if anyone missed any of this interview, don't forget to go to beingpatient.com, sign up for the newsletter where we tell you about talks with people like Marwan. Thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. For more information on upcoming interviews, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter at beingpatient.com. That's beingpatient.com. And send us any feedback you may have, whether it's someone you want us to interview or any comment about our podcast series. You can do so by emailing info@beingpatient.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'm Deborah Kahn.